have three.
Oh, I forgot mine. Here,
So I'm down to two. Here you go. Distribute those, pass those back.
Is he in the right state of mind today?
Okay.
What's our dog saying?
All right. So, just a couple of questions. Some more of our friends.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now we go. Now we're busy.
See, what he says 6:30.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, go to number 10. If you have it in front of you, go to number 10. So these are some questions I'm pretty sure we didn't do previously. I'm pretty sure we didn't do these previously. Number 10. Most of the Irish immigrants that came to the United States following the potato family in the 1840s settled in urban areas of the north, the seacoast cities of the south, rural sections of the old Northwest, California, Appalachia. And of course, the correct answer to that is urban areas of the north. Remember, we talked about that Irish immigration in the 1840s as being large and distinctive, and the first group of, impoverished people that came in large numbers. And the Irish were so poor that we said they couldn't leave the cities that they landed in. So they ended up staying in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and they gave the appearance, because they were there, of being a larger percentage of the population than they actually were. And so this prompted some level of nativism, that they weren't able to dissipate into the larger society. Go to 11. A distinguishing feature, I'm not sure of the answer to this, but I think I know what it is. A distinguishing feature of American society in the early 19th century. Now, the early 19th century is the 1800s, right? The early 1800s. So, okay, a distinguishing feature of American society in the early 1800s. Increasing readership of newspapers. Now, that might be true. Lack of enthusiasm for religious reform. That's definitely not true. Embrace of aristocratic hierarchy. That's certainly not true as well, because that's the era of Jacksonian democracy. Creation of original forms of art and architecture. That's the one I'm leaning towards. Is that correct?
No.
No, is it A?
Yeah.
All right, so increasing... doesn't all the guys come out at that time? American writing, in the aftermath of the War of 1812. Well, not so much for that. Dislike of voluntary associations, that's certainly not true. So you say A is the correct response, increasing readership of newspapers. Wow, that's a tough one. Okay, all right, 27. During the first half of the 19th century, the central and western areas of New York were known as the burnt-over district because of intense religious zeal created during the Second Great Awakening, terrible fires that followed clear-cut logging by pioneers in that part of the state. The area had not recovered from the devastation of the War of 1812. American Indian settlements had been completely destroyed as settlers moved in and took over the land. The region's economy never recovered from the hardship that followed the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, if you had any idea, you would know that the answer to that is A, right? All of the other ones seem reasonable, but the reason they called that the burnt-over district is that there were so many revivals there in the Second Great Awakening, and that's the area that roughly corresponded to the path of the Erie Canal. And it's argued, I guess it depends on your opinion, it's argued that was so susceptible to religious revivals is because there was a lot of change in that area, that was associated with the success of the canal. Now, if you're a religious person, you may say, well, there was a supernatural feature to that, as well. But nevertheless, one way or the other, that there was so much religious revival in that area that they said that the flames of religious revival flowed over that. Now, the Second Great Awakening, we didn't mention that was a part of the background of the age of reform in the 1830s and 1840s. We talked about the First Great Awakening. Who do we associate with the First Great Awakening? What names? Two, yes. Whitfield and who else? Whitfield and who else? Jonathan Edwards. Do we associate any name with the Second Great Awakening? That period, really between 1820 and 1840, a long period of lots of revivals. Do we associate any names with the Second Great Awakening? Anybody remember any names? We did one. Yes?
John Edwards?
No, John Edwards was the first one. The second one. Second one, Charles Finney. Remember Charles Finney? Charles Finney. And we talked about the Second Great Awakening. He's laying the foundation for abolition, for temperance, for all of the other reforms of that time period. Where did it come from? Where did that spirit of reform come from? Well, we said one of the areas that it came from was this idea of the Second Great Awakening. People were inspired, they were converted, they wanted to fix and make society better. And so, yes. All right, 6. Go back to 6. I don't know why I picked this one. It's out of the time frame. African Americans who fled the violence of Reconstruction South in 1879 and 1880 to start anew in Kansas were called the Exodusters. Right? They were black people that left the post-Civil War South and moved to the Midwest. Exodusters. Some of you wrote about those in your West papers, but that's what they were called. 45 and 65. Those will be the last two. All the following contributed to Northern fear of a slave power conspiracy in the 1840s and 1850s. Now, when we talk about a slave power conspiracy, that we said that Northerners were afraid, many were, that the government was dominated by this cabal of slave owners that controlled the national government, right? So what would contribute to that fear? Enforcement of the new Fugitive Slave Law, the decision of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott's case, the imposition of the gag rule in the House of Representatives, the proposal of the Alston Manifesto, and the passage of the Wilmot Proviso. Is C the right answer? The enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law came in the Compromise of 1850, so that's in the 1850s, right? The decision of the Dred Scott is in 57. The imposition of the gag rule is in 36. The Alston Manifesto was in 52. In the Wilmot Proviso was in 45. So, what's the right answer?
Would this be
E?
Wilmot said no slaves?
Okay. The passage of the Wilmot Proviso. Okay, the passage, not the proposal. Okay, the passage of the Wilmot Proviso. Yeah, obviously that wouldn't be the case, right? So that was in 45, right? The Wilmot Proviso was the notion that there wouldn't be any slaves in the area that came. So it's not opposition to the Wilmot Proviso; it's the passage of the Wilmot Proviso. I see. And so that is in 45, and that would be the exception. Yeah, that's another tough one. Okay. All right, 65. The most controversial and divisive component of the Compromise of 1850, I'm going to look for a Fugitive Slave Act. Is C the right answer? The passage of a tougher new National Fugitive Slave Act? Yeah. So the Compromise of 1850. All right, you have the Missouri Compromise in 1820, right? And what area of the country did that reconcile? Slavery was spreading into what area that was resolved by the Missouri Compromise in 1850? What area? Yes. Well, yeah, but where did they come from? Where did the area come from? Yes. The Louisiana Purchase, right? The the Compromise of 1850 resolved the extension of slavery into what new area? The Compromise of 1850, what prompted it? It was dramatic. We said, remember we had Webster and Clay and everybody supporting the compromise and giving these speeches, and Henry Clay standing in front of the Senate and making this proposal, his last and his finest hour. What prompted the necessity for a compromise? Think about the sequence, right? What was the Wilmot Proviso? What war was that associated with? Yes?
Like the Mexican session.
Yes, it's the Mexican cession. So the Mexican War ends in 46, correct? And in the aftermath of that war, there's a huge territorial cession that goes to the United States. And the question that's posed by the Wilmot Proviso is slavery going to be permitted to spread there? And there's this big debate with Southerners saying that it is their constitutional right to bring slavery in the territories, and Northerners saying that they have a right, or Congress has a right to prevent slavery from spreading into those territories. And so this issue, becomes so divisive when California seeks admission to the Union as a free state that the South threatens to secede. And then what remedies that, whether slavery can go there or not, is the Compromise of 1850. And the Compromise of 1850 addresses all of the outstanding issues that divided the North and South over slavery, including a strict new Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the Compromise of 1850, incidentally, only holds for 4 years. What breaks it wide open? Does anybody remember? Yeah, Jim?
So the Kansas-Nebraska.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act breaks the Compromise of 1850 wide open. Now, after Kansas-Nebraska made popular sovereignty unconstitutional, now, with the Dred Scott decision and John Brown's raid, the South are going to kind of believe that the only way, that there's no longer opportunities for compromise to protect their interests, and South Carolina leads the way and secedes from the Union. Okay, all right, good. Now, I don't know how many of those questions we did, but what you can do is tomorrow, if you have any other ones that you want to go over, then we can talk about those questions tomorrow, along with the questions on the practice test. I told some of those other kids that our practice test that we're going to take for a grade tomorrow, somebody asked me, I think it's second period or something, how many questions, on different things. I looked and I counted, and I can't remember whether it was 3 or 4, but the latest it went was Reagan. So there were either 2 questions about Reagan and 2 questions about Carter, or 1 question about Reagan and 2 questions about Carter, but there are no questions beyond the Reagan administration on that test. And there are questions about the Carter administration, but my sense is that they were kind of questions that we might have made some reference to, or that article kind of covered that you read in preparation for doing your papers that you recently turned in. So, I mean, is it worth at some level reviewing Reagan? Maybe. I don't have anything ready tonight to kind of put it together to review, but is it worth taking a peek at that in any of your practice materials? Maybe. It might be worth. I think beyond that, could there be questions about George H. Bush? There might be. That's the Persian Gulf War. George H. Bush, succeeded Reagan. He was elected in '88. The big event in his administration was the first Persian Gulf War. Could there be questions about the Clinton administration? Maybe. I think that, when you think about Clinton, you think of all kinds of scandals, inappropriate sexual things and things like that. But, there also is, the idea of prosperity, this kind of high-pitched prosperity, Clinton moving the Democratic Party to the right towards Reagan, sort of, might be something they might ask. I can't imagine. I'm talking about the AP test, definitely not tomorrow. And then after that, you have George W. Bush. And obviously, in his administration, 9/11 and the Afghan War and the Iraqi War are all, things. Hey, Bob, you guys have a meeting in here tonight.
I thought there was supposed to be one,
Is it?
but I came early just in case I had to move.
Can I keep going until somebody comes to throw us out? They didn't set anything up. That's why I started.
I'll try to get
Yeah, okay. All right.
Fist bump.
Defending the character.
Yeah, but I think they would have something set up if they were coming here. But that's why we just started. So, all right. Now, let's go back to the book. In the book, we're on term 44. Right? And we'll go quickly, I promise. We're on term 44 in the book. right? And I think we did the tenement houses. Sam, you've got nothing. You have no book, no test, nothing, right? That's all right. We had done the tenements, we were into the Gilded Age, we had industrialized, we had urbanized, we had westward expansion, the conquest of the frontier, internal development during the Gilded Age. We had done all of those things, and we said that those things were exciting, they represented a transformation in America, but there were problems, and the problems were particularly in the cities. And we said the tenements were kind of a symbol of that. That people were crowded into these dumbbell tenements in major urban areas. There was no planning. There was no design. People flocked into these cities. They flocked in from Southern and Eastern Europe, impoverished people, and this resulted in crime and disease and other problems in the cities. Right? Now we said that, interestingly enough, no one was really, when I say no one, few people were willing to do anything to help the people who were living in, kind of squalor in urban areas. Hey, what was the name of the book and the author that we said really kind of embodied, chronicled the problems in those urban areas? Book and author. You remember we mentioned this guy, the AP loves this guy. We said he writes a book, 1890. It becomes kind of the quintessential description of the problems of urban America. Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S. And the name of the book, Other Alexanders? How the Other Half Lives. Now, eventually, we mentioned that because the churches, the Protestant churches, because the government and the Protestant churches and society in general really did not seem interested in trying to address the problems of urban areas, it lays the groundwork for political bossism. The political bosses, get their power from providing a crude, and we mentioned this last time we reviewed, a crude network of social services to the immigrant poor and the impoverished people of urban areas, right? Now, we said eventually there were some people inspired by Christianity to do something about the problems of poverty. And we said that they preached a social gospel. And at the core of the social gospel was the notion that poverty was not the fault of the impoverished, right? It was not the fault of the impoverished. It was the fault of circumstances. Hey, what's the difference between the social gospel and social Darwinism, right? I mean, there's a significant difference. There is indeed. Yes, go ahead.
Social Darwinism said that people who were poor because they were inferior and that they would eventually be wiped out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way of putting it. What Emma said is that social Darwinism was the notion that look, there were just differences amongst people. And that some people were, for lack of a better term, winners, and some people were losers. And the losers would lose, and the winners would win, and this was an evolutionary spiral that would result in progress, right? And the last thing that you should do is reward the losers by helping them, right? Because it's their fault. They're losers. That's why they're not succeeding. The social gospel kind of says, no, Christians have an obligation to try to fix the problems of poverty in the city so that people have opportunities. Now, the Gilded Age, to some extent, the last thing that we did in it was talk about diplomacy and foreign affairs in the Gilded Age. And we said that eventually, throughout most of the Gilded Age, Americans were isolationistic, that they were obsessed with kind of internal development, westward expansion, urbanization, industrialization, dealing with the problems of the cities. But by the mid to late 1890s, Americans became more outward looking. And part of the people that led kind of an expansionistic sentiment were the Jingoes. The Jingoes were militaristic expansions. Why did the Jingoes think? Well, who was a Jingo? Who do we associate with Jingoism? Yeah, go ahead.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, very good. Teddy Roosevelt is the person that embodied Jingoism, a militaristic expansionist, wants to expand, build the military, right? One reason why the Jingoes wanted to expand our influence and build the military. One reason, any reason. Anybody? So here are these people that want to expand, militaristic, expansionist. Why? Yes.
Historically, those who have controlled the sea.
Oh, yes. There was this notion. What was the name of the book that justified that? Anybody remember? The name of the book and the name of the author? Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote the book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon World History, that suggested that all great nations were at one time or another a great naval nation. That if the United States wanted to achieve greatness, it had to build its military and it had to expand. The other problem was the rest of the world was doing that. Right? I made mention of this the other day. Remember I said that the French were the dominant power in Indochina? Well, when did they go to Indochina? In the 1850s, right? So the French exert their influence in Indochina, Vietnam in the 1850s. By the 1890s, there were people in the United States saying, hey, what about us? We should be doing this too. We're the greatest industrial power in the world. We have this huge internal infrastructure. But things are going to pass us by. Our greatness is going to kind of, expire if we don't expand. And a big military, a strong navy is going to be necessary to that. Now the Jingos promoted term 46, propaganda, right? Propaganda is kind of a message that promotes an idea. And the idea of militaristic expansionism might be propaganda, right? This is kind of the message that promotes the idea of expansionism. Now, obviously, this idea of militaristic expansionism, and there were other reasons why Americans were expansionistic. We said there were religious reasons, there were cultural reasons, there were societal reasons. There were economic reasons why Americans were expansionistic at that time. Now, what was the Turner Thesis? Just thinking about that. What was the Turner Thesis? It's part of that conversation. Anybody remember, besides the instructor, the Turner Thesis? Cassandra, have you studied the Turner Thesis at all? You have not. John, do you recall the Turner Thesis? Was it the thesis of Frederick Jackson Turner? I think it was. What did it refer to? And how is it relevant to this conversation? The Turner Thesis, what did it refer to and how is it relevant to this conversation? What is this conversation about, incidentally? Tori, what are we talking about? Militaristic expansionism, right? Right, in the late 1890s. So how, and there were other reasons besides wanting to build a strong military to justify expansionism, right? So that's the conversation. How is the Turner Thesis relative to that, or relevant to that? Go ahead, Simon. Go ahead, Jim. Son of a gun. Go ahead, Fisher. Wasn't Turner nervous about the closure of the frontier? Didn't he argue that the frontier was closed and that conquering the frontier is what made America distinctive and great? And now that the frontier was closed, that America's greatness would be lost? Didn't he argue that? And so that contributes to expansionism because we have to look for other frontiers. Now, this kind of expansionistic notion is what leads to kind of conflict with Spain. And we fight Spain. We declare war against Spain in 1898. 1898? Cyber? I think. 1898. Why? What is the issue? We have a declared war with the Spanish, right? I want to say 1896, but I can't be right because McKinley was president. And McKinley wasn't elected until didn't take office until 1897. Probably didn't declare war until 1898, right? And remember, he resisted for some time, and doing the war was only 60-something days, right? So why did we fight? What was the issue? What was the core issue that brought us into conflict with Spain? Right, so we declared a war against Spain in 1898. It is in 1898, right? We declared a war with Spain in 1898. Why? What was the issue? I mean, it's simple, yes. Cuba, yeah. And why would we fight a war with Spain over Cuba? What did the Cubans want? Independence from Spain, and we became interested in Cuban independence. Why did we become interested in Cuban independence? One of the reasons was, yellow journalism. Yellow journalism, as term 47 refers to, is that sensational journalism that William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer promoted in their respective newspapers. That was, sensationalism, the embellishment. Yellow journalism embellished, on the truth. It told sensational stories. And what was the fodder in the Spanish War or in the Cuban insurrection for yellow journalism? I mean, what did the yellow journalists report on in the Cuban insurrection? What did the Spanish do to the Cubans that so terribly disturbed Americans? Does anybody, Tristan, do you recall? Yes, they perpetrated atrocities, put them in concentration camps, the Cubans in concentration camps, and then, allegedly perpetrated atrocities against the Cubans. Now, it's interesting. In the Spanish War, which is a very brief war, we go to war to liberate Cuba from Spanish rule so that they could be independent, right? We pass the Teller Amendment, and the Teller Amendment says that we won't take Cuba as a colony. But ironically, what do we do, Bridget? We take the Philippines as a colony, right? So we don't take Cuba as a colony, but we end up taking the Philippines as a colony, and the Philippines are going to resist our colonialization, and we're going to have our first kind of Asiatic war in battling Filipino insurrectionists or who are attempting to assert their independence from us, right? Bellicose and belligerent are two terms that are generally associated with war. If you are bellicose, your speech is warlike, right? You're a bellicose, it's a verbose speech that is warlike. So if we say that a country is bellicose, that means that their rhetoric, I think you could argue Russia is kind of bellicose now, in terms of their speech about the Ukraine and other things. A belligerent is a participant in war. So if we say, the term belligerent becomes relevant when we talk about neutrality. Can you trade with a belligerent? A belligerent is somebody that's involved in the conflict. So we talk about trading with the belligerents in a war. That means we want to trade with the parties that are involved with the war as a neutral party. And this idea of trading with belligerents and establishing our neutrality is what gets us into the War of 1812, and it's also what's going to get us into World War I. Now, in the aftermath of the Mexican War, the century turns, and in 1900, from 1900 to 1970, is that time period that we refer to as the Progressive Era. Now, what defined the Progressive Era? What do we associate with? Yes, reform. Now, if you look at the Progressive Era is a backlash against industrialization and urbanization and the excesses of those things. The industry, urbanization cause problems. And society by 1900 is looking at those problems and saying, well, look, if we don't do something about these problems, then what we know as America might come unraveled. Remember we said that this group of white, Anglo-Saxon, upper middle class, well-educated, urban-dwelling Protestants who believed that they were kind of the custodians of American identity felt threatened from both the right and the left. Radical movements on the left, socialism, communism, anarchism, violent strikes, overthrows, trusts and monopolies on the right, political corruption, and that they wanted to kind of fix the system so that it wouldn't come unraveled, right? And so they propose a variety of reforms that they believe, that is not really a cohesive kind of set of reforms. You know, progressives, we said, were involved in a lot of different things and a lot of different causes. It was more of a mood or a mindset than an actual movement. But one of the things that the progressives were interested in reforming was the consumption of alcohol. And that leads us to this notion of prohibition. I mean, progressivism was urban. You know, it was the city. And so why are there these problems in the city? Because people drink too much. You know, the temperance movement that starts in the 1830s and 1840s is never really going to go away. I mean, temperance advocates are going to push temperance and prohibition, which are different. Temperance is just tempering the alcohol that you're consuming. Prohibition is just absolutely, you know, prohibiting the distribution and sale and manufacture of alcoholic beverages, right? Those movements aren't going to go away, and they get energy from the progressives. The progressives are going to say, well, look, you know, I mean, we got all these immigrants, and after all, they drink this wine, they drink this beer, they drink this whiskey, and that's why they're all drunk up, and that's why they're getting injured on the job, and that's why they're not taking care of their children, and that's why they're crowded into slums because they won't pay rent. And you know, so we said that the prohibition movement really gets legs from this, and it comes to fruition during World War I. During World War I, our fear is that the Germans, right, who make the beer, you know, are going to kind of, you know, use it to undermine our sobriety so that we can fight them. And so, you know, it is a response to World War I that results in the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcoholic beverages. The 18th Amendment is going to go into effect in 1920. Anybody remember the name of the legislation that enforced it besides the instructor? Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
Volstead Act.
The Volstead Act, yes. And it lasts approximately until 1933. I think the Beer Act was part of the first New Deal that started to kind of loosen up on alcohol, you know, sales. And then eventually the 21st Amendment overturned the 18th and restored the legality of alcohol. And I think part of it had to do with the Depression. That they thought, well, you know, I mean, it's like, you know, illegal marijuana. You say, well, you know, people don't want to, you know, do this, but, you know, if you legalize marijuana, you can tax it, you know, generate revenue. And it was part of the Depression why they you know, re-legalized or passed the 21st Amendment, which overturned the 18th Amendment. 52, the expose, and 53, the muckrakers, are both tied to the progressive era. The expose is different from yellow journalism in that exposés expose the worst defects and terrible conditions of society, right? And the muckrakers were journalists that looked for areas to expose, right? You know, you have, you know, problems in the cities, corruption in politics. You know, you've got the meatpacking industry and other places that are terrible, and we can expose these problems. And when we do, this is going to stir society to action. And when they take this action, they'll try to fix these problems. You know, we said that maybe the most famous muckraking novel was The Jungle. What was that about? Who wrote that, and what was that about? Go ahead, Tanvir.
It was by Upton Sinclair.
You love that name, don't you? Upton Sinclair. And what was it about?
The process.
Yeah, the meatpacking industry. Did that prompt any kind of federal legislation, Tori? The Jungle?
Yeah, the pure food.
Pure Food and Drug and the Meat Inspection Act. Referendum, term 4054, refers to kind of the political idea of progressivism. The big political notion to come out of progressivism is that the government, the state, needs to be the agent of change. So if there are problems, the government needs to be the one that addresses it. So legislation on the state and local level in particular, and to a lesser extent on the national level, to fix problems, to regulate problems or society, is something that the progressives advocated for. A more active government, right? A more active government in promoting social welfare, Now, in order to do that, government had to be cleaned up. So if you're going to use government as the agent of change, then government needed to be cleaned up in order to do that. And so part of that was referendums where the people could vote directly. Interestingly enough, you have a referendum in Monroeville, not in Pittsburgh, but you have a referendum in Monroeville that is somewhat controversial. And that, yes, the library tax, yeah. There has been a proposal to add a 1 mil tax in order to finance the library. And, you know, some people support that, you know, and some people oppose it. It seems like the opponents are putting signs up, vote no for the library tax. The supporters put an ad in the paper. But the people themselves will get to decide. So if you are fearful, and I don't want to say that was a response to any kind of political corruption, but it might be a response to what the supporters of the library believe is a lack of sensitivity by politicians to their funding needs. So we're going to circumvent the politicians and go right to the people and let them decide. That's something that starts in progressivism, right? Okay, you know, we talked about Roosevelt, Wilson, and Taft, you know, and all of that. Well, all right, you know, World War I starts in 1917, and one thing, you know, we really don't have any terms on World War I here, but one thing that you can view World War I as the culmination of the progressive movement. You know, okay, now we are going to try to reform the world, right? You know, I mean, we tried to fix the United States, and now in 1917, when Wilson invites the United States to go to war, he says that we are going to go to war to make the world safe for democracy, right? That we're going to, why are we going to do this? You know, why are we going to enter into this terrible conflict? Why are we going to violate our ancient tradition to make the world safe for democracy, right? And that's sort of the progressive ideology being applied to the world. It doesn't work out that way. Remember, we never ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We never join the League of Nations. Now, term 55, the lost generation, is something that refers to writers who are, you know, disenchanted with World War I. World War I is a terrible thing. You know, when you think back at World War I and you try to say, you know, why did the world do it? You know, I mean, World War II, there's this identifiable evil, Adolf Hitler, that's trying to spread his influence. And to stop him seemed to be just and right. But in World War I, who's the bad guy here? You know, the Archduke is assassinated, and then Russia was friends with this, you know, Germany was, you know, and then the end of the story, all these countries are at war, and for what? You know, the Wilson, when he led the United States into war, he said, well, okay, there's got to be a good reason why we're going to do this. And so the good reason is to make the world safe for democracy. But that's not the reason other people were at war. And so the slaughter, the mindless slaughter, the gas, the number of casualties, the millions of people dead, the destruction of property, caused writers and thinkers to be disenchanted. And these people that were disenchanted is called the lost generation of writers. And I think they spent a little bit of time in Europe. You know, they were bitter about, you know, what had happened during the war. They talk about that in English a little bit. Ezra Pound, Ernest Hemingway, Farewell to Arms. Is anybody, they talk about that a little bit?
I read The Old Man and the Sea.
I don't know too much about literature. So, most stories in literature are made up generally, right? They're not actually true. I mean,
They're dumb.
that's the problem I have.
Real dumb.
Well, all right. So the war is over, and then we have the immediate aftermath. And 56 is a Red Scare. Now, in American history, there are two Red Scares. There is the Red Scare of 1919 to 1921, and there is the Red Scare of 1947 to 1953. In both cases, it was a hysterical fear that there was an internal conspiracy of communists to overthrow the federal government or to undermine society in some manner or another. That communist internal subversion was a threat to the safety and security of the United States. The first Red Scare was a response to a lot, and this is the one that's referred to here, is response to a lot of labor disputes, some violent bombings, some massive strikes that people thought were communist inspired. And they kind of culminate with the Palmer raids, an attempt to identify and round up all the subversives and ship them out of the country. And it's similar to the second Red Scare, because the second Red Scare culminates in the McCarthy hearings, where McCarthy is kind of sort of trying to do the same thing. Identify, expose, and discredit these people who are communist-inspired insurrectionists that are trying to undermine the safety and security of the United States. Now, in the 1920s, you know, we went over this, you know, before we talked about religion, honoring, right? But now we're into the Great Depression with Term 57. And, you know, we said this. We said in 1928, Hoover was elected to the presidency kind of triumphantly. Who did he run against and why was it significant? In 28, go ahead, Jim.
Al Smith.
Al Smith, and why was that significant?
He was Catholic and he was a wet.
Yes, he was the first Roman Catholic presidential candidate. The second was John F. Kennedy, who narrowly was elected in 1960. And his Catholicism, Smith's Catholicism was an issue, and so was Kennedy's in 1960. But nevertheless, Hoover was triumphantly elected president. Some people say more coronated than elected. But the bonus army marks the low point of his popularity. That's because he ordered General Douglas MacArthur to dispel these disgruntled former, you know, World War I veterans who had been promised a bonus from Washington, D.C. They had come there to protest. And the sight of those pathetic people who were encamped there because they had nowhere to go, fleeing tanks and tear gas, you know, was something that really hurt Hoover's popularity. But, you know, I think that there's the term Hoovervilles, and it's a little out of order. Term 59, Hoovervilles, right, is another term that reflects Hoover's unpopularity. That they called these villages that were these shanty shack towns that were constructed outside of, you know, cities out of just garbage. They called them Hoovervilles. And so Hoover, incidentally, in terms of Hoover, we said this. We said that Hoover wanted to help, right? He wanted to help. He does more than any previous president to try to deal with the problems of the Great Depression, but there is a limit. What won't Hoover do that makes him so unpopular? Go ahead. Yes, he will not support the direct dole, right? The direct handouts. And so this limit causes his popularity to be limited. Hoover is very cold, or seems to be kind of indifferent to the suffering of the poor, and the result of that is, that he's not reelected in 32. The bull market kind of sticks out. I don't know why I put that in that order, but the bull market is the symbol of the prosperity of the 1920s. Its crash is the symbol of the depression of the 1930s. Now, we really didn't say that the bull market or the crash of the market was the leading contributor to what caused the Great Depression of the 1930s. Some of the things that we mentioned were problems with international trade, high tariffs, a maldistribution of income and wealth, overprotection. These were overproduction. These were problems that we associated with the depression of the 1930s. And we said that when Franklin Roosevelt was elected to the presidency, that he promised to address these problems, and he does so with the first and second New Deals. Now, there's nothing in here about the first and second New Deals, but we did refer to those in class at one time. What's one thing that came out of the first New Deal? Anything at all? Anything at all? First New Deal. Anything at all you remember? Go ahead, Sid. Yes, the banking reform, the Bank Act, yes.
The agricultural?
The Agricultural Adjustment Act, yes, good.
The TVA.
TVA was part of the first New Deal, yes. How about the second New Deal? What was the landmark legislation that was part of the second New Deal? Alan?
Wagner?
Wagner is important, but more important probably than that, Alexander's
Social
Security in 1935, right? Now, it is true that the first, second New Deal do not fully bring the economy out of the recession. What in fact does is wartime spending on World War II. And we reviewed wartime spending on World War II. You know, we reviewed this just recently, at some length. In terms of World War II, one thing that we didn't talk much about, and we did make mention of this the other day in class, and that was the genocide, you know, the extermination of the Jews, you know, the Holocaust, right? And that was a part of the European part of World War II, you know, where Hitler is going to scapegoat the Jews and, you know, identify them for kind of destruction, the final solution, and execute 6 million of them during the war. And that's kind of the most flagrant example of genocide, trying to wipe out an entire population of people, right? An entire group of people, you know, a religious group of people, you know, in genocide. I mean, it's not the only example of genocide. I mean, there are lots of examples of genocide on smaller levels, even today. But it is the most grievous, by all accounts, you know, in human history. In the aftermath of the war, there is some kind of, you know, debate about the future. And what seems to be central to the post-war world is a competition between the United States and their spirit of democracy and capitalism, and the Soviet Union and their spirit of communism. Now, we see communism as being associated with oppression. And remember, we talked about this. We said, well, look, you know, we weren't quite sure what was going on. Eastern Europe was overrun by the Soviet Union. There were communist rebels in, you know, various places in Europe and in Asia. And it seemed like communism was spreading. Containment is the policy based on George Kennan's notion that Russian communism would spread anywhere America would let it. Right? Anywhere that America would let Russian communism spread, it would. And that it was in the interest of the United States to try to check that expansion. Right? Containment was the ideological explanation of what the Russians were up to. And the first time that containment is put into policy is with the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine says that the United States will fight oppression anywhere it's happening. And we do it first in Greece and in Turkey. But the Truman Doctrine is also the reason that we send troops into Vietnam. Remember, in our discussion, we got all the way up to Johnson sending ground troops into Vietnam. And containment's the reason for that. I mean, look, if you see you know, after 1949 and you see communism fall, or China fall to the communists in 49, you see Asia now as a battleground for containment. If there is a communist attempt to overthrow just a small region of Southeast Asia, it's the duty of the United States to support those people who are trying to resist that. Right? That's the idea of the Truman Doctrine. Now, remember we said that it's never really as black and white as Truman made it out to be, and it certainly isn't that black and white in Vietnam. Now, we wanted to contain communist, you know, oppression abroad, and we also wanted to do it at home. And McCarthyism is another term that refers to that second Red Scare. Right? That second Red Scare. I mean, McCarthyism is kind of this, you know, reckless accusations of people's loyalty, recklessly questioning people's loyalty, and recklessly accusing them of communist sympathies, often because they were different or disagreed on other things. Now, McCarthy is going to come unhinged in 1953. And by 57, he's dead. Now, also we said that in 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected to the presidency. And Kennedy was elected to the presidency. Eisenhower had been the president for 8 years, and, you know, he was limited by the 22nd Amendment for running for a third term. His vice presidential nominee, Richard Nixon, his vice presidential running mate and vice president, Richard Nixon, is going to represent the Republicans. Kennedy represents the Democrats. Kennedy is narrowly elected in 1960. Kennedy is a Democrat, right? And the Democratic Party had been the party of the New Deal. But since Franklin Roosevelt died, Truman, who had been the heir to Roosevelt, wasn't able to extend the New Deal. And Eisenhower, who was a Republican, ideologically didn't think that the New Deal should expand. Now, we said that Eisenhower supported something called dynamic conservatism, where, he supported some elements of, kind of reform and other things, but, Eisenhower was more committed to social stability than he was to social justice. And that was evident in the way that he treated the Brown versus Board of Education decision, not putting his own personal clout and influence on the line to desegregate. Kennedy eventually is going to support an expansion of the New Deal and social justice in terms of voting rights and other things. But Kennedy is only president for 1,000 days before he's assassinated, and he faced a very powerful coalition of Southern Democrats who were suspicious of him and Republicans who were equally suspicious of him. When he dies, Lyndon Johnson takes over. And one of the things that we left you with Lyndon Johnson, and we said that one of the things that Lyndon Johnson does is authorize ground troops in Vietnam and escalate the war. But the other thing that Lyndon Johnson does, and what's more important to him, is that he was ideologically a New Dealer. And he wanted to complete what he thought the New Deal had started. And that was social opportunity for all, which he called a war on poverty. America's post-war legacy would be to alleviate poverty in America, in Appalachia, in the ghettos of cities, urban renewal, slum cleaning, economic opportunity, job training programs, Medicare and health care for the elderly, other things. It's going to be this war on poverty that Johnson suggests will end up in the Great Society, that America will fulfill its final mission. Its greatness will be achieved, right? And so it's an expansion, a significant expansion of the role and influence of the national government. Now, just real quickly, and I promise we'll conclude in a second. If you go back to where we started with the progressives. And the progressives are the first persons that say, hey, look, government needs to do something about problems in society, right? But on the national level, there's not much that happens. Most progressivism is on the legislative and local level. In the New Deal, Roosevelt is going to apply the national government to societal problems, some temporary and some permanent. But it is Johnson, right, who really expands the role of the federal government and tries to address what he sees as inequalities and inequities in society with government programs and activities. Now, if we jump forward to Reagan, Reagan's claim to fame, right, is a backlash against it all. It's too much. It has gone too far. There's too much government. There's too much help. There's not enough individuality. There's too high of taxes. There's too much regulation, right? Reagan famously says when he's inaugurated that government is not the solution, government is the problem, right? And that's a reversal of to some extent of the Great Society, the ideas of Johnson. And Reagan is known for that. Reagan is known for limited government, free enterprise, with, taking back all of the entitlements and other things that seem to have brought America down. I mean, that's, if you're looking at a question, you have no idea, if something says something like that, it's probably right? Now, the last two are unilateral and détente, and they deal with the idea of nuclear weapons. In the aftermath of the detonation of a successful nuclear weapon and its use in World War II, Americans had a monopoly on nuclear weapons until 1949. In 1949, the Russians detonated a nuclear weapon, and we responded to that by building a hydrogen bomb. We detonated one in 1952, the Russians detonated one in 1953. After that, there was a race between the United States and the Russians to build bigger bombs and better ways of deploying those bombs. Eventually, this became terrifying, right? The stakes with two major superpowers with such destructive capacity became terrifying, and at times so terrifying that there were these periods of détente, where you had kind of a cooling of relations, that people would say, like in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we come so close to a nuclear war, people say, oh my goodness, this was terrifying. Let's have a period of cooling off détente. And then, in these periods, sometimes powers like the United States would take a unilateral action. That means we don't care what Russia's going to do, we're going to do something on our own. We're going to disband certain weapon systems, or we're going to stop testing above ground. We're going to take unilateral action. Now, okay, so that completes the 67 terms, about right at 7:30. Now between now and, Wednesday, I mean, you might want to take a peek at Reagan. You might want to finish up your practice test. You might want to ask any other questions about that. We'll take our testimony. There's not too many questions I don't think we didn't cover when I looked it over today. Maybe 5, right, that we didn't cover. So you should be familiar with most of the things on that list. We'll see.
That practice test.
It's a good turnout.
Very good. Mayor Clark, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Josh, you came to everyone? Ron, you came to everyone?
I know, I told my mom to come over and she's like, where? Mr. Wallace. Oh, copy.
Copy is what it was, the destructive farmers wanted, the government to intervene on their behalf, to take over the railroads, take over the banks, remember? They are the ideological forefathers of
Is it better to guess?
Yes. I mean, there's no penalty for this. You might as well.
Just because I'm looking at anything.
Can I use your phone?
Yep.